As landscape photographers, it's inevitable that at some point we're going to want to take photographs with the sun directly inside the photograph. In sunrise, a sunset, some other kind of event where the sun is of interest in the composition that we're creating. The problem, of course, is that invariably we're going to end up with flare. Now, flare is essentially caused when light enters through the lens, hits a piece of dust or dirt, or even a scratch, for instance, and then creates a refraction of light inside or internally to the lens itself. You'll see this as a streak of light, usually reddish, sometimes a little bit of blue, inside your photograph. Now, there's a number of ways that we can mitigate these flare phenomena inside our lenses, or at least the flare that we don't necessarily want to have inside the lens. The first, of course, is keep your lenses spotlessly clean. So part of the problem, of course, is when you've got dust inside your lens or on the front elements or the rear elements and light hits it, it's going to obviously exacerbate any flare that you're going to get. So a spotlessly clean lens is the first step in trying to mitigate against flare. The other problem, of course, is if you're a fan of using filters, and I am, I'm particularly fond of using Nisi filters for a lot of the photography that I shoot, but you're adding another layer of glass in the equation between your subject that you're photographing and the sensor that you're recording it on. So this extra layer of glass is only further exacerbating any flare that might happen in your photographs. And in fact, if you take a look at these photographs, you'll notice that I have a kind of arc of red in one corner, and this is unique to using filters when you're actually shooting a subject. So if you see this in your LCD screen while you're shooting, remove the filters. It's a far better idea to take a exposure bracket and blend the exposures together in order to achieve your highlight and shadow tonality, rather than using a filter and potentially creating flare. However, there is another technique which you can shoot, and you need to be aware of it while you're shooting, because we can rid ourselves of flare by basically giving it the finger. Now, this photograph that I've chosen over here wasn't actually successful, but I'm still going to use it because it shows a reasonably good example of what you can do when things go wrong. Now, this is a photograph of Madonna and her worshippers at the top of Mbindini Abbey in the Drakensberg, and you can see the sun is rising through a sort of thin layer of haze, and we've got quite strong sunburst happening as a result of that sort of partial obstruction of the haze itself. And I wanted that. That's great. But if you look down over here, you'll notice there's quite a strong line of flare occurring as well. So we need to get rid of that. Now, I took a series of photographs so that we could blend them together, and in order to obtain a greater dynamic range, because obviously our sky is quite bright. But as you'll notice, as my exposure increases, the sky blows up quite a lot. And here we've got what I call giving it the finger. In this last exposure, you'll notice that we've got a nice brightness coming out into the shadows as well, and we've got enough detail. But this line here and these little bits of flare are very, very strong. So we need to get rid of them somehow. And the easiest way to do that is in your final exposure, or all of them in fact, which is probably a better idea, basically hold your little finger out over the sun. Now, because there isn't that direct specular light hitting your pieces of dust or whatever is causing the flare inside the lens, you lose the flare. There's no more flare. It's not going to occur at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring these photographs into Photoshop and then use this final image in order to get this area of the photograph without any flare. Okay, so step one is I'm going to develop the images ever so slightly. At the moment I'm using Capture One, so we're going to go to our first photograph, and I just want to bring some of my highlights back a little bit. So just bring that back, and I need to open up some of my shadows. I don't need to do a whole lot of work to the photograph. That's not the point at the moment. And I'm going to try and avoid things like clarity and structure, because that's going to create problems down the line. Rather stick with your contrast sliders. So I can bring a little bit more contrast into the scene. I think that would work because I want to show some contrast in the middle range mountains as well. You don't need to worry too much about your foreground in this shot. At the moment, what we're thinking about is our highlights, because this exposure was shot for the highlights. So we can add our contrast, that's looking okay. We can open up the shadows a touch just to bring that out in the foreground, and we can play with our highlights, blacks and white sliders a touch. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to copy these adjustments, and we're then going to paste them across to the rest of the images. And you can do the same in whichever program you happen to be using. It's very simple using Lightroom. It's also simple using any other digital asset management software or raw editors. Okay, so I've already opened up these photographs into Photoshop. So I'm going to jump through to Photoshop, and you'll see that I've got my 3 photographs as TIFF files now inside here. Now, what's particularly interesting, and one of the reasons this was a difficult give it the finger shot, is you'll notice that the color actually changes between these 2 photographs. The lens I was using here is an old 24mm lens, and the actual clarity on the lens is not that good compared to the modern day optics. And by blocking the sun, the haze that had occurred all the way around the image, actually giving it a kind of magenta glow, has disappeared. So we're going to have to deal with that in post-production as well. So first off, we need to get all of these images into a stack in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is just go to File, come down to Scripts, and I will say Load Files into Stack. All right, we'll add our open files. Oops, hang on a second. I just need to save all of these images. I obviously, because I fiddled with that, it did that. So anyway, we'll go back to File, Scripts, and we're going to say Load Files into Stack, and we can say Add Open Files, and I'm going to attempt to automatically align source images for the simple fact that every now and again there's a little bit of a bump. Maybe the wind came and knocked you slightly. Anything could have happened. So at any rate, we've now got our images aligning nicely in a new file, and you can see here at the top of the stack I've got my my skylight shot, and just to keep things clear I will note this. So I'll click on the title inside the layers palette over here, and I'll just say highlight. So this is my highlight shot, we know that. Layer below that is going to be my midtones. Layer below that is my shadows. And the last layer here is going to be my finger. Alright, so we're going to give it the finger. Now, the simplest way to do this if you want to blend these exposures is simply to grab into your highlight shot, grab a nice lasso tool, you can see it up here, shortcut key L, and do a very, very rough selection of the area that you're wanting to work on, and simply click and create your mask. Once your mask is created, you can see where the selection has been, so all we need to do is feather that out quite broadly, and you'll notice it slowly disappears until we're quite far out and it's almost non-existent. We can barely see where it was. Okay, so there we go. That is the first technique that we can use. It's not necessarily the best technique though. So I'm actually going to use something slightly different. So we're going to remove this over here, delete the layer mask, and I'm actually going to use the Tony Kuypers layer palette or luminosity tools. So what I'm going to do is I want to select these highlight areas. So I'm going to look at a lights 1, see if that's going to help. Possibly a lights 2. Let's see what's going to happen there. That's looking a little bit better. So essentially what we're wanting to do is select all of this light area over here, but we want to get everything else so it's more or less not selected. So we can refine it a little bit by making sure that our blacks stay black. There we go. And I also want to make sure that these lights stay up nice and light as well. So I'm going to just quickly grab my burn tool, and we're just going to essentially fix up our mask. There we go. Right, so what I'm doing is I'm making sure that my final mask, which is everything that's white over here, is going to only select the bright tones from the image that I want. And in fact, if we'd like, we can even go further and we can dodge a little bit on the shadows over here as well. Okay. Right, so essentially what we're doing is we're making a perfect mask for the sky section. So I'm going to just hit my little create marching ants tool and then create a mask. And there we go, there's our sky. And one of the cool things about this is you will notice that my edge is perfect all along here. This is absolutely perfect. Alright, especially down in that area here by the Moeni needles in the sun. So I've decided to use luminosity masks to create my blend, but of course you can do it more simply using the lasso tool. At any rate, we now have our sky shot, okay, and it's looking alright inside there. What we still want to do is get our midtones so that they're looking okay, and then we want to bring out the shadows a little bit before we remove our flare. So I'm going to take a look at my midtones over here. That's good, just in this area. And I think this time I'm going to do it quite roughly. I'm just going to quickly grab a mask, and I'm going to invert it so it's black. And I'm just going to take a 50% opacity brush, and I'm going to brush in using white ink that area that I'm wanting to work on, or that I kind of like. So I'm just going to do this very roughly. Doesn't have to be very neat. There we go. Right, that's looking decent. And again, I'm just going to feather that quite strongly so that we can blend it nicely. Right, that's looking okay as well. Now, we're now down to our shadows over here. And you can see we now have this problem with the flare. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group all of these images, or these layers, the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. So I'm going to hit Command G, I'm using a Mac over here, and we're going to group this and create a mask over here again. And now very simply, all I need to do is take a black ink, so I'm going to swap it over here, hit X to change it, I'm going to take my black ink and I'm going to draw out where my flare is. Okay. And in fact, I'm going to do it even more so over here because I can be rough. I don't really need to worry about that much. There we go. And remember, we had that issue as well with the haze. So I'm going to just paint all of that out. Now, the problem, of course, is if we zoom in a touch just over here, you'll see there has been a slight sort of tonal change and color cast change between where we had in fact, I'll show you by doing this. The color has literally changed from a slight red to a slight blue. So what we're going to do is grab our bottom layer, the finger layer over here, and we're going to just add a contrast curve to it. So I'm going to hit curves, and we're going to try and match the exposure above. There we go. It's just very gentle. You don't have to do a whole lot of work to this. There we go. And because it was slightly red, I'm actually going to go from the RGB channels down into the red channel, and I'm just going to bump up the red by pushing this up just a smidgen. There we go. So basically what we've done is we've tried to blend the color of the two images so that we don't have that issue between them anymore. If you don't like the red in the bottom little section over here, it's quite easy. You just stay in your curves palette over here, and using your black brush, you'll just paint that out. And there we go. So you can keep it nice and soft as well. You can see that my hardness is at 0, and we just roughly pull that out over there. Okay. Right, I've now gotten to a point where I essentially have what I call my base exposure. So I'm just going to crop this ever so slightly because you could see that there was some movement between the images, and I don't want the edges of the frame to be fiddling with or creating any issues with any future masks that I create. Okay, so we're going to let that crop briefly over here. Okay, now very, very simply, I can spend a lot more time working on this photograph, but the basic idea was to just show you how to get rid of the flare. And again, just to show you how that worked, let's just, it's this one here, let's really just disable the mask. And you can see there's the flare, and it is now gone. Okay, so as a final sort of workflow image over here, what I'm going to do is just increase my contrast a little bit. So let me just open up this image. I want more contrast overall in the scene, and a very easy way to do this is to again use the TK7 Rapid Mask. And what I'm going to do is this time I want to hit Layer Mask. Now that means that as I create my mask, you'll actually see the change inside there. And I'm going to go and create a... Oh, sorry, wait, hang on a second. I first need to create my contrast curve. So I'm going to go Curves. I'm then going to say Layer Mask. And we're going to go to our mids. Now, what's cool about the mids is it's a very quick way to be able to add contrast in your scene by simply dropping your shadows quite strongly and bringing up your highlights. And it's going to just build a kind of contrast into the scene, which is really, really quite effective. And there we go. So you can see I've just created that, adding the contrast inside there. What we can also potentially do is I want to see some more detail inside this area here. So this time around, I'm going to grab my curves tool. We're going to bring up the lighten, and we're going to add a bit of contrast to this as well, just like so. Obviously, it's creating issues elsewhere, but we're going to play with that later on. So there we go. That's looking better. Right, so we're wanting this area to be sort of adding some contrast to that. So I'm going to go into my forget layer mask at the moment. I'm actually just going to come inside here, and we're going to choose our darks. Let's see what we look like. So darks 2, and that's more or less reasonable. That area over here is what we're wanting. So let's just see darks 1. I think I'll stick with darks 2. And just to make sure that we don't affect the sky, I'm going to bring that out over here. And we're going to also open it up, I think. So we're going to do some... Oops, wrong one. Sorry, that was dodging. I need to burn in a bit. So I'm just going to burn this in a bit over here, along the edges. Here we go. That's looking good. Right, and up along the top. There we go. Right, so again, I'm basically making a perfect mask, which is really cool. And then we're going to say, use our marching ants. Now, while we've got our marching ants in place, I'm just going to delete this mask over here and add it again. And there we go. Right, so you can see we're opening things up a little bit over here. I don't like what's happened out there, so I'm just going to go back into my mask, and using the brush tool, I'm just going to remove that. We don't need it out on that side either. There we go. Right, it does look like there's a little bit of a halo occurring over here. I have discovered that that wasn't actually anything to do with the photograph. There was haze that was lighting up in the actual valley below us. So regardless of how you photograph, you can never get rid of that haze. It's simply there. It's a fait accompli that's not going to disappear. Okay, at any rate, there's a decent start to the photograph as I was looking at it. As I say, the photograph itself wasn't entirely successful. It wasn't exactly what I wanted from the shot, but I think it gives a fairly basic idea of how you can very quickly just get the flare out of your photograph. The critical thing, though, is that you have to remember to shoot with the aim in mind that you're going to use your finger inside the shot. So pre-visualize your image, shoot your stack, but make sure that you also have a photograph or several photographs of different exposures with your finger over the sun so that you can remove any flare. Okay, I hope you liked this very brief tutorial or show on how to get rid of the flare from your photographs. If you liked it, please do subscribe. It would be great to see you in person on a workshop at some stage. Otherwise, you can also drop an email to me if you have any questions, and also if you'd like to see anything more like this particular video. Cheers.